This bill will be now read a second time. I give the call to the member for Hotham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's a huge privilege to speak this morning on the Social Services Legislation Amendment, and I do so on behalf of many thousands of older Australians and pensioners that I represent as the member for Hotham. And I take that responsibility very seriously, Deputy Speaker. In many ways, I'm very much in awe of some of the older people who I represent in terms of what they've done to build up this incredible country that we get to play a privileged role in. I don't want the House to forget that the people whose incomes are affected by the legislation that's before us today, they created so much of what we love about Australia. One of the things that is so much at the heart of the Australia they created is a feeling of egalitarianism amongst Australians. We have a social compact in this country that says when you grow older, when you have worked your whole life, when you've paid taxes, when you've worked to build this country, then the government is going to do its part by helping ensure that you live a reasonable retirement. And it's not a retirement, Deputy Speaker, that merely keeps people with enough food on their plate. That's not the sort of country that those people worked for and that we represent in this House. We want in Australia, as the country grows more prosperous, for everyone to benefit. That's fair. That's the fair way of doing things. And that's why, Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to stand today to say that the essential measure of cutting pensions for part pensioners that lies at the heart of this legislation, Labor will not be supporting. We will not do that to the pensioners who rely on government to live in a reasonable retirement. Deputy Speaker, the Conservatives on the other side of the House have a lot of things to say, a lot of talk about how much they respect older Australians and want to protect them in their retirements. But there's a big difference between the rhetoric that you hear on this side of the House and the rhetoric that we hear on the other side of the House, and that is, as well as talking the talk, we in Labor walk the walk. Older Australians, as I've said, deserve a retirement that doesn't see them living in poverty. And when Labor came to government under the Rudd government, one of the first things that the government did was ask the department to come back to the government with a proposal that will see retirement incomes for older Australians lifted up. And the Minister for Social Services, Jenny Macklin, was in charge of that process. And what we found, Deputy Speaker, was something very concerning, and that is that when the Howard government left office, there were literally millions of older Australians in this country, having worked their whole lives, paid taxes their whole lives, raised children, built businesses. Millions of older Australians in this country were living in poverty. And what the Rudd government did was made the biggest increase to the base pension rate that had occurred in this country for 100 years. And in a single act, that government brought millions of Australian people out of poverty. Now, we have something in economics called revealed preferences, and that is a way of saying that the only way to really judge what people really value is to watch their behaviour. And I would say to you, Deputy Speaker, that if you look at the behaviour and the record of Labor, you will see that every time a Labor person comes into this House and talks about how seriously they take the representation of older people in their electorates, we back that up with real policies and real protections for people. And that's not what we see today by people on the other side of the House. Now let me get to what we have seen from this government so far. We saw the conversation about retirement incomes very much one of the quote-unquote unity ticket items of the last election. And we heard Tony Abbott walk around the country and say to Australia's pensioners, absolutely no changes to pensions, no cuts to pensions, no changes to pensions. He said it over and over and over again, Deputy Speaker. And yet what we've seen since this government has been in office is more or less constant attempts to try to change and cut pensions. They've tried it one way, they've tried it other ways, they've done many other things that will affect essentially the retirement incomes of Australians, such as the GP tax, raising the cost of meds for older Australians, and we know that all of these will increase the burden and the cost of living on older Australians. And, Deputy Speaker, what we've seen Labor do is fight them on really all of the essential measures that would see the incomes and standard of living of older Australians cut. And again, I would just say that I'm really proud of that. But what we have seen the government try to do is cut the indexation rate of pensions. That would have seen, Deputy Speaker, over 10 years, older Australians $80 a week worse off as a consequence of that change. Now, the policy itself was an absolute shock coming as it did on the back of this sort of parade around the country saying that the level of commitment that the Abbott government would have to protecting retirement incomes. But what really upset me about this, Deputy Speaker, was the falsehoods and the lying that went on about what this change really was. Question time after question time, we sat in this chamber and we asked the Prime Minister why he was cutting the indexation rate of pensions, and he would stand up and talk about how pensions were going up. Pensions were going up. You can probably hear it ringing in your ears as I can. And, Deputy Speaker, older Australians are not silly people. They're not the silly people that the Prime Minister would take them for. They know that when the indexation rate of their pension is being cut, over time that means that they'll end up with less money in their pocket than they otherwise would have. And I hope that what we see during the course of this debate about retirement incomes, some level of respect shown to older Australians, that when you are cutting your pensions, you'll be upfront and tell people that that is what you're doing. Now, Deputy Speaker, the changes that we see in the bill before us, we know are going to see 327,000 current pensioners worse off, and over time about half of all pensioners will be worse off as a consequence of the changes. I was very lucky to host a morning tea for seniors in Hotham in the last few weeks, and the Shadow Minister, the member for Jagga Jagga, was there with me. Deputy Speaker, you probably won't be surprised to know that we had a flood of people. We had about 150 people there. 90 people had to go on a waiting list because we weren't actually able to fit the people that wanted to be there in the room. And I would say, Deputy Speaker, that despite the kind of upbeat nature of our older Australians that we usually see, there is a real feel of deep anxiety out there amongst seniors. And they've got pretty good reason to be anxious, I actually have to say, because all we've seen, as I said, on the other side is constant attempts to try to reduce their incomes. But I do want to just say, Deputy Speaker, that it's an important moment today for us to pay tribute to the work of the member for Jagga Jagga in what she's done for older Australians over the time that she's been in this place. And I have to say, although the people in the room with us at the morning tea did feel a lot of anxiety, everyone who was there, and I think everyone in this House, would acknowledge that the member for Jagga Jagga has fought with everything she has to protect the incomes and the quality of life of senior Australians. And for the seniors that were at the morning tea, I just think they're so grateful that they know that there's a politician at a really senior level who they can trust, that they know is going to go into bat for them. And she's doing that again in Labor's stance on this legislation today. Deputy Speaker, we were able to talk to a lot of seniors who will be affected by the bill that's before the House today. A lot of part pensioners were there. Again, a lot of anxiety about what this legislation is going to do to their incomes. And, Deputy Speaker, I just want to make it really clear that the people who were there with us at the morning tea, they're not millionaires. Absolutely not. They're not millionaires. They're people who've worked in ordinary jobs for their whole lives, people who've been prudent, who've put aside a bit of something extra where they can, and who over time have been able to put themselves in a position where they're accessing a part and not a full pension. Deputy Speaker, the inference that the people affected by this bill before us, that they are millionaires, is brutally offensive. And I think, again, just getting the politics of this so wrong. If I can give a bit of free advice to those on the other side, the people who will be affected by this legislation know who they are. They know they're not millionaires, and you going out there and telling them how well off they are and how little they need government support is neither going to get the legislation across the line nor win you any votes at the next election. But in speaking with the pensioners at the morning tea, and I know through a lot of detailed policy work that the Leader of the Opposition and the Shadow Minister have done together, that's helped us reach the conclusion that we'll not be supporting this sort of central change in here about the part pension. And, Deputy Speaker, as the detail of the legislation has become clearer and as we've seen some modelling that's been done, I think there's a lot of reasons why we see this as a really regressive proposal. Deputy Speaker, we know that there are people in Australia, single pensioners, who will be $8,000 worse off as a consequence of the measures in the legislation here. A couple pensioner will be up to $14,000 worse off as a consequence. 236,000 pensioners will be $130 a fortnight worse off. That's almost $3,500 a year. And, Deputy Speaker, a further 91,000 Australians will lose their pension altogether. Deputy Speaker, modelling by the industry super Australia has shown that in 10 years half of all future retirees will end up with less money in their pockets than they would have had otherwise as a consequence of the legislation. But, Deputy Speaker, there's a lot of confusing things about our retirement income system, and I would just say to people who are listening at home, to people who are trying to make their own view about these proposals, what you really need to know here is that this is a cut to the pension of $2.4 billion. Whatever is going on here, whatever machinations, whatever different proposals come forward over the coming months, just remember that this government is trying to cut your pensions, and that is what they've been trying to do since they were elected to office. Deputy Speaker, I referred before to some of the equity issues here, and the government has been saying again and again in question time that this is a policy that's about millionaires who are also accessing a pension. Deputy Speaker, NatSem, which you know of course is one of the most robust and authoritative modelling organisations in Australia, has looked at the impact on this legislation to older Australians, and what they've found, Deputy Speaker, is that $8 in $10 of the savings in this measure will be paid for by the lowest fifth of income earners. So I just want to absolutely put this to bed. This is not about millionaires, this is about middle Australians who are going to see significantly lower incomes as a consequence, and cuts to the pension as a consequence of what's in the legislation. Now, Deputy Speaker, we do need to have a conversation about retirement incomes in this country, and Labor is trying to be a constructive voice in those discussions. We know, Deputy Speaker, that over the next 4 years we're actually going to see the tax concessions that apply to superannuation outstrip the amount of federal budget that is going towards the pensions. So this is becoming what most commentators agree in Australia is unsustainable. A tax system which was trying to do something very sensible, which is encourage Australians to put money into their super, is actually outstripping our expenditure on the pensions. We do need to look at this, and Labor wants to have a serious debate and a serious policy conversation about whether this can continue. We know, Deputy Speaker, that a third of superannuation tax concessions go to the top 10th of income earners. And again, I would just say we also know that 70% of capital gains tax concessions and a third of negative gearing concessions are also going to this group. So I think we do have an issue to address here. Labor wants to have a real conversation about it. But what I would just say is that the narrative and the rhetoric that's coming from the other side is not really actually going to any of these important strategic fiscal issues that we face as a nation. What we have heard from the other side since they were elected to government is a lot of noise about how unsustainable the budget is, but then the first thing they did was get rid of a tax that applied to some of the biggest polluting companies in Australia, and instead change our carbon trading system into something that means that we now have taxpayers paying big polluters to try to reduce their pollution. They ditched the mining tax, and then they've spent the next 2 years crying poor and saying that pensioners are the ones that have to pay, when effectively the two first things they did as a government were cut taxes to some of the biggest companies in the country. Now, when we have this discussion, which I hope will follow in the coming months about retirement incomes, I want to make it clear that Labor is not going to be buying into this bogus dichotomy between superannuation tax concessions and the pension, Deputy Speaker. If we were to take the government's arguments that this distinction exists to its logical conclusion, we wouldn't really have a tax system in Australia. I know that a lot of Australians of high incomes actually acknowledge the fact that a lot of their wealth comes from the fact that government provides lots of infrastructure and lots of other things that have allowed them to run successful businesses and other things. Many Australians have planned for their retirement on the basis of a fair pension, and as Labor people that's what we'll be fighting for. There is a little bit of an undercurrent here to what we hear about in question time and what we hear in these debates, that people don't need or deserve certainty because they are relying on government for pension. And I would just say that that is absolute tosh, and I will be absolutely fighting against that rhetoric. If anyone needs certainty about their incomes in this country, it's pensioners, because at the stage of life that they're at, they can't do anything to change their incomes at that moment, and that's why government needs to be clear about what it wants to do and be consistent in the policy it puts in place. So, Deputy Speaker, I'm very pleased and proud to continue a Labor tradition in this House, which is standing up for Australia's pensioners, standing up for fair retirement incomes and standing up for the seniors that I represent in my community of Hotham. And I'm very pleased to say today that we will not be supporting cuts to pensions yet again, and yet again we're standing up for senior Australians.
I thank